welcome everyone again to this first research seminar from the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I'm particularly pleased today to start this series for this term with a scholar who is also a friend of IIPP, Professor Mzukisi Qobo, and also Professor Simon Roberts from the University of Johannesburg, who is also affiliated to UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Professor Qobo is currently the head of the Wits School of Governance and has been in the Wits School of Governance for some time, also in the business school as a professor of strategy and international business. And he is currently also a member of the Presidential Economic Advisory Council, which is supporting President Ramaphosa in South Africa in designing the new economic policies, and in particular also addressing some of the urgent responses to the COVID crisis. Professor Qobo has worked extensively both in academic research, but also in government. He has been for some time Chief Director for Trade and Policy at the Department of Trade and Industry in the South African government. We are having some issue again, hopefully. Oh gosh. Hello again.
I think there might have just been an internet connectivity issue, but I can see that Mzuki's back, so.
Okay, hopefully the.
Fine.
Sorry, this is generally quite smooth, and since now we are having some issues. I know Professor Qobo was mentioning that at the moment there might be issues in South Africa with electricity and connection, but hopefully this is not going to disrupt the seminar more than it has already happened. I was just mentioning that Professor Qobo has been both very active in academic research, but also in policy work in South Africa, in the past also in the Department for Trade and Industry. And he has recently published a number of books, and in particular his forthcoming book, China-US Relation, Digital Future and African Agency, will be coming out soon in early 2022 with Palgrave Macmillan. Professor Qobo will give a talk on a very topical issue, building state capacity in South Africa in the era of pandemic. And as usual practice, we will be having Professor Qobo talking for around 30-40 minutes, and that will be followed by a discussion from Professor Simon Roberts, which seems to have also some technical issues. Professor Simon Roberts is a professor at the University of Johannesburg and also a visiting professor at UCL IIPP, and is a recent co-edited volume, Structural Transformation in South Africa, the Challenge of Inclusive Industrial Development in Middle-Income Country, is also a new contribution to the debate. So it will be responding to Mzu based on that work. Someone is back. The connection seems to be good now, so hopefully we are good to go and ready to start. So without further ado, thanks again for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours. So I think you have to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, thanks for that warm welcome. Indeed, I'm a friend of IIPP, and I'm glad that in the room I have good friends, yourself, Simon, who I've known for a number of years, and I saw Reina joined in, so I feel safe. The theme that I'll be addressing today is that of building state capacity in the era of COVID-19. Many countries are battling with this idea of building state capacity, especially in the context of a severe pandemic that we countenance today. In South Africa, this has been an ongoing challenge for many years. I think since the onset of democracy, the advent of democracy in 1994, and more so in the period between 2008 and 2017, 2018, a period that some characterize as that of state capture or wasted decade. And we'll touch a little bit on this. I want to be clear from the outset that the institutional challenges in South Africa did not begin in that era. They are deep-seated, and their genesis predates that era. Now back to the theme on state capacity, and the reason why we're so focused on this notion of state capacity. It's largely to do with the fact that major social and economic change in societies is possible when the state is healthy, and when the state has the capacity to implement. And this is much needed in an era of in the time of crisis. Whether we look at the Depression years in the interwar period of the 1930s, or we look at the post-war reconstruction, i.e. post-1945. We look at the onset of world recession in the early 1970s, or the global financial crisis and the present pandemic. When things are not working, citizens look to the state. They want the state to be visible. They want the state to undertake certain actions that will deliver change. Now, in the case of South Africa, as I indicated, the challenges of state capacity are long-standing. These are not to do necessarily with absence of policies. I think many people are saying that we have plenty of policies in the country. We have been in a festival of developing policies since 1994. Rather, what is lacking are dynamic capabilities within the public sector to implement transformative policies and to innovate for the kind of change that could yield or create, lay the foundation for new industries, support small and medium enterprises, and innovate or yield innovation in the economy. As I indicated in the past, we've formulated many policies. Some of these include your accelerated and shared growth initiative in the early 2000s, the National Development Plan of the National Planning Commission in 2011, the New Growth Path, and more recently, the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Program. And currently, we also have underway a master plan process, which is sectorally focused. I happen to facilitate one of those master plans, one on agriculture and agro-processing. This is an attempt to bring together government, the private sector, and labor. So it's a social compact process to drive economic recovery, to boost performance in those sectors, to promote competitiveness, to support exports, but also to ensure inclusion. Now, despite all those interesting initiatives or developments, we still see very little results in the way of improving the performance of the state to deliver on its tasks, to provide, to lead economic change, I mean, more recently, we saw that, in the latest figures from Stats SA, that the unemployment rate has climbed up to 34%. And this is really, in my view, signify a crisis condition. And three months ago, we had political unrest throughout the country and the looting of stores. And this was triggered by the arrest of the former president, Jacob Zuma, for defying the Constitutional Court. But it was clear that not all those people who went on rampage were necessarily in support of the former president, but they saw an opportunity to raid stores, to loot, and this really signaled the state of deprivation in South Africa, and the failure of the state to deliver social and economic outcomes. Now, some may be asking a question: what is state capacity? When you talk about state capacity, what exactly are you referring to? I draw this this conception of state capacity from a joint paper we put together with Reina Cattell and Mariana Mazzucato to look at what is required today in South Africa to shore up institutional capabilities. So in short, in my view, state capacity refers to a broad set of resources and capabilities that enable the state to achieve its strategic goals or mission. It is also about the predominating mindset in the state, the quality of institutional ensemble across the state, the character and strength of the mechanism that coordinate policy thinking within the state, as well as strategic capabilities and technical skills to implement change. So in sum, it is the right mindset for change, the political framework that allows for such change to be possible, as well as the confidence to engage with an array of social actors, including market agents in society. Now, in my view, state capacity is not just about problem solving on the margins or to perform, or the ability to perform routinized functions. I think it should be about transformative change marked by an activist state, especially in a time of crisis as deep as the one we face today. Now, regarding the interface of the state with the economy, in a working paper that I referred to, which Reina and Mariana, myself put together, we argued that the state should not be seen as merely a market fixer, but also a market co-creator and shaper. And I'll give an example later on by way of the country's electricity utility, Eskom, to demonstrate both the failures and the opportunities for the state to be a market co-creator and shaper. Certain attributes that the state should have, and this draws from the earlier work Mariana did in 2018. These attributes are that the state needs to be bold and address societal value. It needs to have concrete targets, i.e., it should know when to get there. It needs to be invested with research and innovation capabilities. It needs to operate cross-sectorally as a cross-actor and be cross-disciplinary. Also, it needs to involve multiple competing solutions and bottom-up experimentation. Now, if you look at these attributes, you will find them on paper in various policy pronouncements in South Africa. Whether this is in the form of the ongoing master plan processes, in the form of the the district development model, which is, for those who are not familiar with the South African planning process, it's more or less similar to number 10, joined up governance that was popular during Tony Blair era. Cross-sectoral, cross-actor, and cross-disciplinary. You have a lot of activities that are aimed at coordinating processes between government, the private sector, and social and other social actors via a social compacting model we call the National Economic Development and Labour Council. So all of these are on paper, but they don't find meaningful expression in implementation. And I will talk a little bit about why we have problems related to implementation deficits in the state. Now, on the conceptual part, I do want to make a point that it makes little sense to think of building state capacity for its own sake. In the South African context, and I would argue that in much of the developing world, the state has a transformative role to play in shaping the distributive outcomes of policy, especially to benefit those that are on the margins of the economy, as well as to overcome structural constraints to inclusive development. This is not unique to South Africa. Other governments in the developing world and increasingly in the developed world are battling with challenges related to social inclusion, to equity, and in some respects taking on a racial dimension. If you look at the US. Now, on that point, I would like to take a very brief detour from South Africa, and I'll come back to it when I make concluding points on how to build state capacity in South Africa. So I want to make a brief detour and take a look at a sample of countries that in recent times have been battling with building state capacity to realize certain mission critical outcomes in those countries, to build resilience and to build for the future. And I sampled the US, China, and Europe. COVID-19 has compelled many countries or regions to show up their institutional capabilities to build back better and to achieve resilience. And state capacity has a vital role today, more than ever before. Even if you read the recent World Economic Outlook of the IMF, I've not read all of it, but it's very clear there that there's a lot of emphasis on the need to calibrate fiscal policy to achieve certain objectives in this time, especially as some countries are increasing their vaccination rate. After faltering in their responses to the first and second wave of the pandemic, countries like the US, the UK, and China, and those in Europe formulated strategies to build long-term resilience. In the case of the EU, this is expressed in the Euro Economic Recovery Plan, which is propelled by 880 billion euros. A financing package that is replenished through borrowing from international capital markets and with a disbursement mechanism that comprises grants, concessional loans to various EU member states. The institutional design of this is meant to achieve better coordination of plans of the different EU member states in order to align the economic values of various countries to a greener and more digital economy, while also addressing socio-economic challenges that are specific to individual countries. So there's a union-wide sort of normative preference about the direction of recovery, greener, and digital transformation, but also the sensitivity to what is the socio-economic challenges that member countries are faced up with. Some of the key observations that I make out of the EU's approach to building back better include a clear mission of what governments need to set and achieve, a strong coordination, as well as an attempt to harness economic recovery to other critical transformative outcomes, such as those that I've highlighted: your green recovery, digital transformation, and inclusion. And for me, this underlines the importance of sound state capabilities and why governments should go big in their interventions during crisis times. For its part, the British government has ventured into the domains of the economy where the invisible hand of the market has failed to generate new sources of vitality for growth and innovation. It has converted loans under the 1.1 billion pound state-backed future fund scheme, which was part of the COVID-19 relief measures, into equity to boost the supply side of the economy, and most importantly, to promote your small and medium enterprises. And this state injection is backed by Britain's state-owned bank, which is, the business bank of Britain. And in my view, this signals a shift from having a blind faith in market fundamentalism as an instrument to ignite economic dynamism to recognizing the role that the state can play in economic recovery. And by no means am I suggesting that Britain is perfect or these are best practices per se. I mean, those of you who've read Christensen, you would know that he places a great premium on the importance of context when we compare countries. There are certain lessons to take, but also there are things that would not fit context elsewhere. In the case of the US, you have the American Rescue Plan Act, which is bolstered by a 1.9 trillion rescue package, a recovery initiative that proposes to offer direct stimulus payments to those who earn $75,000 or less annually. It also extends generous unemployment benefits, provides food aid, etc., and it's underpinned by a large-scale infrastructure Build Back Better program in order to create greater resilience in the economy, while also striving to achieve racial equality in the US. Now, again, there are great lessons here in terms of the importance of having growth and enhancing approaches that are combined with strong social protection measures that would reinforce capabilities among the most vulnerable in society rather than leave them to the wolves, as happened during the global financial crisis. Now, China is a different animal altogether. Its recovery program is heavily state-driven, and it has come, under a lot of attacks especially from Western countries, more so against the backdrop of the geopolitical tensions. Nonetheless, I think there are important lessons that China offers, such as, especially those that come from its recent 14th five-year plan, 2021 to 2025, which stresses the importance of strengthening national security system and capabilities, supporting food security, energy, and financial security. And these indicators are essentially about using the state or state capacity to reduce vulnerability, to promote inclusion, and to improve long-term resilience of the Chinese state, of its economy, as well as of its people. There are also industrial policy outcomes that are tied to achieving, promoting advanced manufacturing, new technologies at the high end, healthcare sectors, environmental protection, etc. So what this, I think the final point to make here is that in terms of shaping market outcomes, or rather coordinating or governing the market, if you like, the Chinese leaders embed the country's economic recovery plan within a social solidarity framework that compels market agents to make a meaningful contribution to, towards achieving a cohesive society. So what all these lessons point to is the importance of bringing the state back in driving socio-economic change and in building resilience rather than relying entirely on the markets. There are a number of factors that inhibit these sorts of interventions in South Africa, that inhibit that undermine state capacities in South Africa. For me, the first of these has to do with ethical leadership, and these are, I'm setting this out in no order of importance, but ethical leadership that is able to gain wider legitimacy in society, I think, is critical for a country like South Africa, which is still fairly young. Although, I mean, we've been a democracy for for 27 years now. There've been a lot of missteps, and our institutions lack solidity. And we've, as I said when I started, we wasted a good 10 years through state capture or large-scale corruption between 2008 and 2018. So ethical leadership is going to be really very important for positioning the state to lead a large-scale social and economic change. There are various linked to this notion of ethical leadership. There's an array of institutional weaknesses and governance failures at the municipal, which is the coalface of of service delivery, at the provincial level as well as at the national level, which have undermined, as I said, the legitimacy, but also the ability of the state to deliver on its developmental mandate. Now, one of the institutional innovations that on paper look good that government has proposed in the recent times is what they call district development model, which is a form of a joined up governance at the local government level between adjacent municipalities and districts to coordinate the delivery of services, but also to provide a room for, say, infrastructure development or innovation in governance in those areas. This will fall flat for the reasons that I've stated, which is the institutional weaknesses linked to absence of ethical leadership across the different tiers of government. So as you can see, ethical leadership, and this is not a woolly concept, it's real, because where there is large-scale corruption, there's a diversion of resources from the poor, from areas that have greater need, to projects that are supported by the elites. The second one has to do with the resources for effective utilization of state capacity, especially in state-owned enterprises. South Africa has about 700 state-owned enterprises. That cuts across, your municipal entities, those that exist at provincial level, and those that exist at national level. The most significant of these are not more than 20. We've recently done an exercise as part of the work by the presidential, the Presidential Council on State-Owned Enterprises, to look at the systemically important state-owned enterprises. That is, if these enterprises were to collapse, which enterprises, if they were to collapse, would have massive negative effects on the economy. So they're not more than 20, 21 really. They pretty few, but they, the effect of their underperformance is massive on the fiscus, because they are covered by state guarantees. And the failures of the governance failures of state-owned enterprises have led to many voices that have argued for their privatization. And my view is that this is a wrong idea. There's no blanket solution to improving the performance and capacities or even governance of state-owned enterprises. What is required is to make a clear determination of which state-owned enterprise could, has a long-term public value, but also could be commercially viable. But you do need to define in very precise terms the developmental utility of a state-owned enterprise. Not every state-owned enterprise has developmental value. Some need to be privatized, some need to be broken up, and some need to be recreated, and some need to undergo business model innovation. And this is where I won't belabor this point. I want just to take the example of Eskom, and in a really simplistic way. Eskom is the electricity utility in South Africa. Next year, it will be celebrating 100 years since the promulgation of the Electricity Act in 1922. And it faces an existential crisis due to mismanagement, poor governance, lack of investment in maintaining its infrastructure, and it's saddled by debt. Since 2011, South Africa has opened up a series of windows to attract the participation of private entities, renewable energy, independent power producers, into the energy markets in order to part to pay fidelity to our commitment to the COP process, climate change mitigation, part to diversify our energy mix and to shore up the security of supply of energy. Now, the major fundamental strategic error that I foresee, especially in the reorientation of this state-owned enterprise, is that everyone is calling for coal to be buried. I mean, South Africa depends the power, energy. We depend on coal. 80% of our electricity needs are met by coal, which is a dirty resource, no doubt about it. But it would be a big strategic error to bury coal altogether rather than reduce gradually. I mean, you see in the UK at some point they ran out of carbon dioxide to kill chickens and as well as to meet the needs across for food security. You see in China the state has asked its power plants to ramp up coal-fired power stations. So for base load, you'll always need this, but you need to diversify, bring in the renewable energy providers, and crucially, and this will be a powerful expression of state capacity, for Eskom to be a key and active player commercially in the renewable energy space, to follow the money, both in South Africa and in the African continent. And if it fails to do so, it faces a real existential crisis. Now, let me move towards conclusion. I'll skip many of the parts, but I'm happy for my draft paper to be circulated. I'll ask them Antonio to circulate a revised. I'll clean up a few editorial gremlins. But to conclude, I argue, well, there are a few 3 or 4 critical success factors for building state capacity in South Africa. It does not need to copy everything that other countries are doing. I was not using those examples for South Africa to copy them. However, the country's leaders need to set a bold and clear mission that places the economy on a sustained recovery and to generate resilience dividend for South Africa for generations to come. Leadership has to have the conviction and urgency to tackle policy and legislative bottlenecks that stand in the way of economic change. Thirdly, there must be strong institutions that are geared to accelerate the implementation of government plans and programs that are, rather than reinventing or inventing new ones. When I started this conversation, I pointed to examples of government plans and policies that are gathering dust, that are poorly implemented. And finally, I think government needs to marry growth-enhancing interventions with a broad-based social protection package that is coupled with investment in hard economic infrastructure and also promote greater participation of small and medium enterprises in the economy. For me, this would be a minimum basis for building resilience. Positioning the role of the state in South Africa to build resilience. I'll leave my discussion there, and then we'll take up the questions and comments. And also Simon's input later. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I think it was very, very interesting to hear from you. How you're thinking about what is happening, what has been happening in the past, and what could be done in the future about the current situation. So I'm particularly interested in coming back to you with a number of issues that you raised, but in particular you talked about ethical leadership, you talked about the role of state-owned enterprises, and of course the broader opportunities for industrial policy, for broader structural transformation and putting South Africa on a more resilient type of path. But before that, and before we have a chance also for the audience to engage with your presentation, Simon will give 5-10 minutes remarks, comments, share with his thoughts, and then we will give Professor Qobo a few minutes just to react. And in the meanwhile, those of you who are interested in asking questions, they can both put them in the chat, and I will make sure to keep track of them, or they can raise your hands, and you can then be graduated to the panel to ask directly the question. Simon, please.
Thanks, Antonio, and thanks, Mzukisi. It's great to be here to kick off the conversation. I should say that I haven't had a chance to read the draft paper, so I'm really just kicking off the conversation, I think. I have read the earlier working paper that Mzukisi referred to, and I think it's really, really interesting and useful paper, and I'd really recommend it to people. And it's proposing a model of dynamic state capabilities and really pointing to a number of challenges, including digital transformation in terms of a mission-oriented approach. I think it's a really useful, really important paper. There's so many things to pick up on here. It's difficult for me to know kind of where it starts. I'm gonna keep my remarks really, really brief. and just reflect on a couple of areas, not do justice to the presentation. So apologies in advance for that. I mean, I think to start with South Africa as a case study, as Mzukisi said, South Africa has had plans and policies, as many as you could hope for, in a sense, throughout the period from 1994 to present, and now has a series of master plans. And so I think there is a really important question in terms of what do we learn from this in terms of state capacity and the role of the state. What do we learn from a country which is really engaged with policy formation around economic change in different dimensions, but hasn't seen the outcomes in terms of the objectives, and hasn't seen implementation, and has had most recently in the past 10 years seen essentially a process of state capture of corruption on a grand scale. And I think it's really important to see that that period of state capture as reflecting partly the failure of the previous plans, because essentially we're seeing a structure of distribution of wealth and control in the economy, which has not changed nearly as much as it needs to. Very high levels of unemployment, and so if you were sitting in 1994 and you were saying, in 27 years' time, this will be the structure of the wealth in the economy, this will be the levels of unemployment in the economy, is this sustainable? I think, at that point, everybody said, no, this will not be socially sustainable. This is not viable. And we're sitting in a situation where we haven't seen that change. Now, of course, there's been lots of changes that have happened in terms of technologies. There's the rise of digital technologies, mobile communications, services sector growth. So the economy has changed in many ways. But at the same time, if you're looking at the structure of the economy in terms of the main goods exports, for example, if you look at the financial sector and structure of the economy on that side, it's changed remarkably little. And this relates, and my comments here relate to work we've done in a book on structural transformation in South Africa, which really points to the lack of change in lots of different areas. And so it's kind of a story of path dependency. And I think rather than, ethics are clearly important, but rather than focusing on ethics, really understand, well, why have we not seen this implementation, these changes? And I would want to focus instead on highlighting interests and power groups and the nature of the political settlement. And I think in the work in that book, and I should highlight that there's a chapter that I'm referring to here, which I was co-authored with Pamela Mondliwa. It's open access in OUP, so if people are interested. But we basically arguing that what's happened in terms of the implementation is that in many of the areas, and I think some of the policies that Mzukisi referred to are examples of that. Rather than having a mission which really changes that direction, we've had a process of bringing in some additional interest, essentially to bolster the incumbents. So if we look at the policies in energy, would be is obviously very central in the economy. We've seen very low cost energy in the past, and energy utility was actually lauded as very efficient, and South Africa was the lowest cost of electricity globally. But who benefited from that low-cost energy? It was large minerals and capital-intensive minerals-based businesses. Essentially, that was an export subsidy for capital-intensive businesses. So you had an export subsidy which reinforced the existing structure of the economy. Now, this was completely unsustainable. The question is, what to do about this now, and how quickly does it need to pivot? If we're looking at, I'm going to talk briefly about agriculture, because I think this is a really interesting case. So under apartheid, the state intervened extensively, supported cooperatives of white farmers and interests of the white population, but through a mission, if you like, a mission-oriented approach. It was very, very clear, very planned, very coordinated, cutting across markets. And the decision in 1996, through an act, Marketing of Agricultural Products Act, was to essentially sweep everything aside. So it wasn't to say the state tools are really useful, let's reorient these tools for the majority of the population, for the Black South African population, for tying it into land reform. It was instead to say that the apartheid state intervened in these ways, and these ways are what the apartheid state was wrong, and these ways are outmoded. And this was also, very shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, etc. So it was really much, at that time, it was to sweep aside all of those regulations, and instead to say that competition law will be the fix. So there was a debate at the time around what to do with the concrete silos, the storage facilities for grain, which had been built by the state and essentially bequeathed to white farmer cooperatives. And they were allowed to be privatized, and there's been a whole series of competition cases about the power in the hands of large grain traders because of the ownership of those silos. But competition law is a really imperfect way of dealing with this. These cases take years and years and years, and fundamentally you still have ownership of this critical infrastructure in the hands of very large and now multinational or internationalized businesses. The one counterexample that we referred to in what we've been doing is actually interesting because it shows what can be achieved with different policies, which is citrus. The citrus sector had not been highly supported by the apartheid state, and it managed after 1994 to lobby as an industry body to reinstate some of the collective levies, and for the Citrus Growers Association, which was representing the main growers, the farmers, as part of wider programs linking also to greater inclusion, to invest in capabilities in logistics, in bringing new varieties, in meeting the standards required in export markets. So essentially, a more collective approach around this. Now, it's far from perfect, but South Africa is the second largest citrus exporter in the world. It's a huge success story. It's a success story which was very much about the industry partnering with the state. The state negotiated, obviously, market access and all the regulations that have to be applied, but it was diametrically opposed to the liberalization which happened across agricultural sectors apart from citrus, and I should say apart from sugar, which has had a highly regulated system which has remained in place. So I just want to highlight that there are some examples which show that moving away from a kind of market fundamentalist approach, which is what I think has characterized quite a lot of the measures, but also looking at which interests need to be served is kind of critical to understanding the role of state capacity. I see this very much as kind of complementary to the papers that Mzukisi referred to. So I thought this might be useful in terms of the conversation going forwards. I think that the last point I want to make is that elevating competition law into the role of kind of state policy has been an issue that we should learn from, because while competition law is really important as a complement to state policies and missions, they're not substitutes. And I think while the authorities have been successful in addressing a lot of conduct, it has maybe potentially diverted attention from the policies that are required for wider structural transformation. And I think that's the second lesson that I'd like to just put on the table. So let me finish off there. Just some thoughts to kick off the conversation. I hope they were interesting and useful.
Thanks so much, Simon. Thanks. I think that's very much complements what Mzu has been discussing so far, and bringing in the, of course, the dimension of power and structural transformation to put the state capacity into that type of perspective. We have already a few questions that are coming in the chat. Again, for those of you who would like to join the discussion, you can raise your hand and I would be more than happy to upgrade you to the panel to ask the question directly to Simon or, of course, Mzu. Mzu, would you like to address Simon's remarks briefly? If you have any specific comments or points you would like to pick on to link up to his remarks, and then we will start with the questions.
I usually like a very robust engagement, but it's difficult to disagree with anything Simon said, because I 100% agree. In fact, we've just done a paper. It's a working paper. I'll try to share it here on the platform, looking at the history of the agricultural sector, the points that Simon made, the extensive support by the state, financing, logistics, marketing boards, all of that, and the logic behind that support, and what the failure of, or rather the deregulation era portended for Black farmers in South Africa today. Now, one of the very interesting examples for me of weaknesses in state capacity is again in the agricultural sector. I sit in a position of facilitating the master plan of the agriculture, and we have conversations with most of the commodity groups, including your citrus, wine, your animals, and so on, other crops. My reflection is that if the state, the capacity of the state is weak, it will negotiate a social compact on a back foot, and the outcomes that are generated through a social compact will be very weak. So you can't negotiate economic transformation. A weak state can't negotiate economic transformation. So the outcomes will be minimalist. Whereas, I mean, again, I don't like the example of China. It's, I have a lot to disagree with in relation of China. It's sort of socio-political, a settlement. But you can see the contrast when a very confident, sound, strong state is shaping the markets, has the capacity to shape the markets, or to force private agents with conditionality. I think Mariana wrote another paper on, I think it was co-authored with you, Antonio, if I'm not mistaken, on conditionalities. A weak state can't put conditionalities because the private sector will show it a middle finger, and that happens all the time because they don't respect the legitimacy of the state, and that's what I deal with almost on a day-to-day basis. It's the most frustrating thing because you know that the outcomes you will achieve are marginal. They mean it's a social compact that is empty, right? So I agree with you, Simon. Then to take a question from the chat, someone asked what are the attributes of what are other factors of state weaknesses? There are many, there are plenty. One is there's a growing what is called juniorization of government, meaning that the top layer of government, I'm not saying everyone, but increasingly the top layer of government, your director general, deputy director general, chief director, is more junior than was the case 10 years ago. So there's been a decimation or an evaporation of skills, talent from government to the private sector, to universities, to the NGO sector. What you are left with are individuals, and again, not everyone, just so that I'm not in trouble, are individuals who don't have, who lack strategic leadership and technical capacities to drive large-scale projects and to overcome constraints, and those constraints could be to do with silos within their departments or silos across government, and they have the capacity to negotiate some of the political constraints. Those individuals are no longer there. They are continually leaving the state. Other factors I've already highlighted, poor coordination, lack of confidence in the state, especially when they deal with the private sector, and a host of other problems that are at the provincial and local government.
Thanks, Mzu. I refrain myself from adding comments to some of the issues related also to the problem of conditionalities and, of course, state capacity in that space. Let me just pick up a few questions here and in fact invite some of the people who raised this question, if they want, to join the panel. There's one from Amadeo Watkins. Amadeo, would you like to join, or would you like me to read the question? If you'd like to join, I'll raise your hand and I'll allow you to talk. And this is about really where do you start? Where is the intervention point to state capacity or policy delivery? I think lots of questions were about exactly sharing your analysis, Mzu, but asking questions around how do you address this problem of building state capacity, and what is the entry point for that, especially when lots of these institutional weaknesses are interconnected, interdependent. And there is another question from Patricia. Patricia, again, if you're in the audience, would you like to join, please, again, raise your hand, and I will be happy to bring you in. Patricia is asking actually something more about the energy transition. And how realistic is this challenge as a priority for South Africa and other sub-Saharan African countries? Would you like to start with these two? One related really to building capacity, where you start from, and specifically in the context of the energy transition, you discussed about the importance of approaching the transition, looking at incremental pathways that take into account the current structural configuration of the energy system in South Africa. Would you like to start with these two?
Yeah, I'm happy to start there. I must say from the outset that I'm no energy expert, but my observation is that the energy, we have to go the decarbonization route. So that's beyond, that's beyond contestation in my view. But where we aren't clear is the just transition, how it should look like, what it should consist of. Now, if you look at South Africa's carbon footprint and when the bulk of it was generated, my understanding is that the bulk of it was generated pre-1994 during the height of, I would venture to say, during the height of industrialization post World War II, up to when industrialization encountered, many challenges, partly as a result of, the world recession, but also the sanctions in the 70s, 80s. But what some call the minerals energy complex was shaped during that era, and it benefited the white minority in South Africa, and also distributed high margins to firms highly concentrated, predominantly white-owned firms, that have become large over time. Now, the just transition has to begin there. In terms of how you shape distributive outcomes to benefit those who are not part of that generation of high carbon footprint, in reconfiguring the energy markets in South Africa going forward, in the renewable energy independent power producer. On the safe side, I argue that Eskom should have a strong footprint in these new energy markets. It's a state-owned enterprise, and this assumes that Eskom, the governance issues are resolved, that the restructuring is done appropriately. Because if you look at, if you look from 2011, 2012, thereabout, when the first renewable energy project was cast on the ground. These projects have never been able to sustain large-scale jobs. These are not job-creating projects. They are not labor-intensive projects on a sustainable basis. In the main, these are fairly skills-intensive projects. So beyond construction, so if you think renewable and labor intensity, think construction, because that's where you put together these imported components. And we've not succeeded in localizing the manufacturing of solar panels or wind turbines. So invariably, these companies are from Spain, from Denmark, from other European countries, China. So the just part is where people talk about just transition in this energy or decarbonization. They tend to talk about jobs that will create, will retrain people and create jobs. And it's unrealistic because you can't take coal workers and tomorrow make them skills intensive in the renewable energy sector. So we ought to be realistic about what we're talking about. And finally, I think it's frankly speaking, I think there is something fundamentally wrong in having Britain and some governments from the EU coming to tell South Africa how it should undertake its energy transition and dangle climate finance on terms that are not guaranteed to be in the interest of South Africa in the future. So there's a lot of wrong in, and I mean, it's an agenda that is also championed by NGOs, mostly European funded. So you almost, there's a certain almost Taliban-like fundamentalism about, the decarbonization, that when you argue, people, they shut you down. They don't want to listen to the nuance and the textured points about, the sort of balances that are required to get it right. And then finally, the points about dynamic capabilities. I think I've covered this, really strategic leadership, building a cadership of public servants that have technical finesse and overcoming some of the weaknesses in the political administrative interface. Because in South Africa, you have directors general, they are appointed by president, but ministers who are executive authority have to oversee those directors general. And this creates tension, because when a director general would have a certain program for the department, and then the minister gets changed, the new minister doesn't quite like that director general. And also because the delegation authority for other layers of government, deputy director general and chief directors, lie with the minister, and the director and the minister might not renew the contract of a director general because they want to achieve certain outcomes that are unethical. That is the ministers in the department. And this goes back, and this is the final point. So when I talk about ethical leadership, I'm not just referring to the bureaucratic layer of government. The problem in South Africa is that this problem lies largely with the political class, because if the political class is unethical, sooner or later, the bureaucratic layer will mirror those tendencies, or you will battle to attract talent to work with a political leadership that is compromised. So that, I mean, we can talk. I mean, the political administrative interface will require its own, its own seminar, because there are many layers to it. Thanks.
Mzu, may I just follow up on this issue? I know Simon is very knowledgeable about the energy situation as well, so you might want to make some comments on that as well, how you see that issue evolving. And it's a very contested discussion at the moment in South Africa and broadly of course, in the region. So it would be interesting to have some of your perspective on that as well. And a follow-up question, which was related to the case of Eskom, was also broadly speaking related to state-owned enterprises. Mzu, your talk you mentioned, here I'm referring to Barot Sirin question. You mentioned that some SOEs in South Africa might need to be broken up or privatized, and Barot is wondering how much it has to do with unethical leadership, or if you have other things to add in that respect. Simon, may I ask you to join the discussion here and bring in your perspective on the energy side, and then eventually also on the state-owned enterprises as well with Mzu. Sorry, we cannot hear you. While you try to sort it out, Mzu, would you like to address this part related to the state-owned enterprises and what you mean about the possibility of broken up some of them, privatize some of them, or use some of them in a more strategic way, as in the case of Eskom? Yes, Simon, you are back as well.
Yeah. Maybe you can. Maybe Simon can start. I'll focus on the SOE question in the main, and maybe a bit on energy, although I think I addressed it.
Excellent. Simon.
Okay, sure. Sorry about that. Yeah, look, I mean, energy is a big question in and of itself, of course. I mean, the first thing is that it's clear that the emissions were all essentially all created by a very small number of countries. And so, these countries are now imposing the costs of the transition on others, including South Africa. I mean, this is obviously, a global question, and it's very important that countries like South Africa and other developing countries form a strong coalition to push back. But I think the problem I have is that South Africa, to do that, you need to say, here is our plan. Because South Africa has had a really energy-intensive industrialization path that really stands out globally in terms of whether there's now, it's very bad, isn't it? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Guys, apologies.
If you remove your video, it's just the connection.
Yeah, it says my internet connection is unstable. Yeah. Sorry, apologies again for that. I was saying that I think, in order to be able to put an alternative on the table, that plan needs to be fleshed out and needs to be a roadmap, needs to have a roadmap. And it needs to dovetail with changing the structure of the economy, because this energy intensity has favored a very small number of very important interest groups in the economy. And I don't see that plan being put on the table to change the energy policy combined with changing the structure of the economy. So how is South Africa going to move away from this dependency on these energy intensive industries? Where is the plan, for example, in terms of steel, to look at moving over, it will be over a period of time, but this surely is a mission, moving the steel and the ferrochrome and the foundries, which are so essential, over towards alternative energy sources, which would be something like hydrogen. So, for South Africa to go into these debates to say, well, we don't like the conditions you have, here's our alternative plan, and this is linked to a roadmap which it links together. In liquid fuels, which is also a really big part of energy, we're just starting to see Sasol, the main company, coming forward with alternatives for it to be part of it. And this is a really good opportunity for kind of the mission combined with conditionalities. So where we stand right now at present is Sasol is still very favored by the fuel regulatory regime. So when, Mzukisi, I wanted to put you, when you say the state is weak, well, so the state has lots of levers with regard to this issue. The feedstock, the natural gas from Mozambique, the fuel regulatory regime, these are all parts of government policy. And it's not about being for or against its interests, it's about how is it going to happen? And what are the things that need to be put in place for this pivot to happen? And I think it's one of the main obvious missions that will really prove whether it's actions or words. We've all seen lots and lots of words, and I guess the question is, you don't necessarily need that many people in the state, in actual fact, because these are key decisions rather than lots and lots of technical expertise. I would argue it's really about key decisions relating to which interests you're engaging with and how you're engaging with them.
So we go back to the political economy fundamental issue here in terms of how to create coalitions that support such an agenda, which has a much more systemic structural transformation perspective, which doesn't simply look at the specific challenge of the energy transition, but actually frame that in the broader transition that is requiring the rest of the economy. So would you like to complement, also broadly speaking, you talked about SOEs, and I think there's quite a lot of interest on your perspective on that. And then I will invite Dr. Moko, who is also from the South African government, who is part of our executive education program, to join for his question. And Patricia also raised a few questions. If you are keen to join the discussion, please raise your hand. I will make you a part of the discussion as well. Mzu.
Yeah, I again agree with Simon. I take his point about that the state isn't necessarily weak. When I made this point, I was a bit tentative because, I mean, there are aspects of the state that have been hollowed out. I mean, there's no question that top skills in the state have left. They've left. I mean, I used to work in government. Simon used to work in government. The former head of the budget office at Treasury is my colleague at VETS. I mean, you can count many top. former Director General at National Treasury, is now at Standard Bank. So you have many. So there are weaknesses, no doubt about them, but they are not as yet, deep fundamental weaknesses in the sense of, a weak state. When people talk about a weak state, Simon is right. The state has many levers. He has mentioned some, but there are also, some of the levers at development finance institutions. The many state-owned enterprises that it has, some are healthy and others are not, and a suite of incentives that the state still commands, as well as policy and legislation as part of the instruments for conditionality. So the problem is that I don't think there is an appreciation of how to use these levers to achieve critical mission outcomes, what I think Simon refers to as decision making, because the state doesn't make decisions for the sake of making decisions, but it seeks to achieve certain missions. And I sometimes feel that those missions are not coherently articulated. So if you were to ask today, you talk to people at senior level in government to give you a concise view of, sort of a language of that defines where South Africa is going, a narrative, a crisp narrative of what South Africa seeks to achieve, you will get thousands of answers. So I agree with him there. On the SOE questions, and maybe just another point Simon touched on, I think the trajectory, the low carbon trajectory, by and large, will happen through the activities of the private sector. Sasol is one example. The financing institutions, Nedbank is pulling out of financing, the coal projects. In the case of the World Bank, that's a multilateral development institution. But the private sector and the MDBs will play an important role in managing this transition without even government, taking an accelerated path that does not have buffers for the sectors or sections of the population that are on the margins. Now, on the SOEs, there is a process underway in government. I can't say much about it because it's really behind the scenes. But the idea is to create a central agency that will coordinate or provide. So you take away the oversight process from government departments into a professionalized agency. Government remains a shareholder, but it exercises its shareholder responsibility through this central agency, and then board members, professional, highly competent, effective, independent, and ethical board members are then appointed, who would then appoint the executive and play and oversight and set strategy, etc., etc. So the process of determining the character of the different SOEs is still underway, and I really can't say more about that. But there's a lot of serious thinking about how to reconfigure SOEs. I will say I was surprised that this South African Airways was brought back in, and I thought it would be one of those. But there's a nice configuration there because they are private sector players that are brought in, and so there's a partial privatization, if you like. But there are questions raised about this whole model. One of the best models we've had in the past is that of the telecoms utility, the Telkom. I think the way the state went about it was excellent, and Telkom has proven to be a sound company, and the state is a passive agent. It still has a shareholding, but no one thinks that Telkom is owned partly by the state. So I think there are a couple of models that can be looked at to rationalize SOEs, but to build those that can work best and make them work best. But you don't adopt an ideological blanket ideology that says we don't need state-owned enterprises. We do need state-owned enterprises in certain area for clearly defined missions. We may not need them in some areas.
Which, in a sense, I think this is interesting because some use of golden shares and forms of renationalization or reacquisition of strategic control of some companies is happening not just across the global south, but also in the global north, in the sense that there is an emphasis of trying to identify strategic productive capabilities and assets that have to be sort of given some public purpose or public direction. Of course, very interesting, Zu, your reference to Seyssel and other companies. In the book with Simon, we've also looked at level of financialization in the private sector among the top companies in South Africa. South Africa remains one of the most highly financialized country with a GDP which is 3 times, sorry, the stock market which is 3 times, capitalization which is 3 times the GDP. So it's a country also where the private sector has been able to generate profits, but not particularly good in reinvesting some of these profits. So that's posed further challenges in terms of an engagement between public and private. I wanted to give Patricia and Dr. Moko, who were raising questions before, the chance to actually ask their question or make their comments directly. I put you in the panel, so you are Patricia. Would you like to start and make your remarks? You had a few in the chat. Maybe if you can introduce yourself, would be great.
Yeah. So my name is Patricia Ugboma. I am, I'm a recent PhD researcher at the IIPP. Returning, having done an MPA in innovation and public purpose. And I am particularly interested in this topic, and I'm so thankful that I was part of it today. And it was quite delight listening to both of the profs, and particularly keen on the mission-oriented innovation approach from a developing world context, and to ask Prof, because you're working with IIPP, with Rainer and Antonio and Mariana, and how realistically one can operationalize that. I mean, it calls for collaboration across sectors, actors, and so on. But in sub-Saharan African countries, in view of the unique political economy dynamics, how do you think this can really be operationalized and really take off? Yeah, basically.
Thanks, Patricia. And Patricia also come from Nigeria, so it's another important, of course, the other big economy in Africa, and it would be interesting to see also how much of the experience between the two countries can be shared. Dr. Moko, would you like to also make your remarks, and then I'll leave the last 5 minutes to Professor Qobo to just conclude.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I just want to ask Prof. Qobo, is South African government implementing a structural adjustment program of the World Bank and the IMF through its fiscal consolidation? And then the second part of my question you alluded, but I still feel the strongest views of the role played by the political administrative interface in weakening the capacity of the government in South Africa to discharge its constitutional mandate. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Moko. Zu, would you like to address these last 2 comments, questions, as we are going towards the end of this session?
Questions. So I won't do justice, but I'll try. I want to address the political administrative interface. because I've touched a bit on it, and I said that will require a whole seminar. We've written about this, by the way, with the head of the National School of Government, which is on the government side, Busani Ngaweni, in the latest edition of the new agenda. So I'll be happy to share the paper with you if you drop me an email. So we spend quite a lot of time addressing this, and also it's addressed in the professionalization of the public service work that is currently underway. So yeah, we can chat more about this. The mission-oriented innovation is also a big question, because in my book on US-China political economy, the political economy of US-China tension, digital futures, and African agency. I have two chapters that are dedicated to Africa's digital futures. One is extensively look at this, and the other one looks at the implications of tech wars on Africa, and how Africa needs to orient its agency. Some of the most obvious challenges in the continent, and that includes Africa, the digital infrastructure, digital assets are really very weak. The tech digital ecosystem has many constraints, including skills, the level of government support for digital skills, the extent to which the national, the weaknesses within the national system of innovation, and weaknesses in the sort of interface between government, the universities, and the private sector to generate innovation. And the skills really, for me, are the most, is the most important assets for mission-oriented innovation across the different sectors of government, including in the public service. Since the early or mid 2000s, government had an entity called the Center for Public Service Innovation, CPSI. And we've just concluded work for them. And it's clear to me that despite having this institution in government, very few people know about it, not just outside of government, but those in government. So it's not optimally utilized to create a mindset of innovation, a culture of innovation within government, and to define ways in which innovation can be promoted within government. There's a lot of rhetoric about innovation in government, about e-government. It's happening in various pockets, but there's no major push. This is what I was referring to when I talked about lack of conception, clear conception of critical mission outcomes, both on the digital side and on the green economic recovery. Digital side, green economic recovery side, as well as a structural shift in the economy with respect to the character and the direction of your industrialization. I mean, this is Antonio and Simon's staple foods. So everyone talks about this, but when you take a closer look at how government shapes its delivery mechanisms via policy and the instruments it has at its disposal, these are not properly deployed or directed. And you find this across the African continent. It's the institutional quality. You can't run away from that. It's the institutional quality that is non-existent in many African countries. So I'll leave it at that. And the question on the World Bank and IMF, the South Africa is not implementing those policies. It's responding to a set of challenges that emanate from the rising cost of debt service debt servicing costs, and the dwindling fiscal resources that would make it harder for the country to meet certain social needs in the future if it's not managing its debt. And there are arguments about to what extent you need to tighten the purse. How do you calibrate your fiscal policy versus social policy, etc.? But we're not following as a country the IMF World Bank structural adjustment program. In any case, South Africa's exposure to the World Bank is very, very limited. Beyond the Medupi financial parlay of the World Bank to South Africa, and they talk about battery storage financing. South Africa isn't taking a lot of money from the World Bank. We started taking a lot from the IMF using the emergency window that has very soft conditionality. So we're not following that path.
Thanks so much. I think we have almost, actually, we are already out of time. Let me thank both you and Simon for a very engaging discussion, and the audience to engage with us in this event. This is just the beginning of our seminar series. We have other 4 events scheduled for this term. Let me just say the next one is going to be by Padmashree Sampath on local production of COVID-19 vaccine, a collective capabilities approach. And Padmashree has been working, among other countries, also in South Africa on issues related to manufacturing scaling up of vaccine capabilities. So we will be back to South Africa next time from a different angle, but very much coherent with what we discussed today. So thanks everyone, and thanks again, Mzu and Simon, for joining us today.